Does less cooling in the new PS5 make it an objectively worse console? Well, I thought so until... Are you stupid? I hope not.
PS5 has exposed a lot of clickbait YouTubers. Liquid Metal doing its job. You don't need overkill heatsink.
Yeah, I agree. Were you trying to argue with me or something? Maybe I should have made a video like this. Gotten some traffic to my channel. Yeah, maybe you should have.
You are spreading fear and unnecessary doubt without any concrete evidence. I thought you're better than this. Shame on you. Unsubscribe.
Pro tip. Watch the entire YouTube video before making a comment that was addressed at the end of it. You know, I probably said this will very likely never affect you at least 10 times.
If I see you, I'm calling you out for your BS, so don't make a fan meetup because it's on site. Sony forever.
I'm an engineer too, and I just think, admit it, you're not a hardware engineer, you're a computer engineer, so you can't speak on this. Yeah, hold on, just give me a second. What's going on, dudes and dudettes? It's your boy Innocence, and I am currently enrolled in my 4th year of university for computer engineering, or hardware engineering, whatever you want to call it. So yeah, I'm learning how to make silicon go beep boop, so trust my opinion, please. I never thought speaking a fact would get me or this man right here into so much trouble. Yeah, this guy is right, believe it or not, and anybody who disagrees is wrong. If you guys aren't aware, I uploaded a video about a week ago stating my opinion on the whole Austin Evans PS5 debacle. If you didn't watch that, I'll link it down below, as well as Austin Evans' original video so you can get a whole grasp as to what exactly is going on. But basically, this guy, Austin Evans, released a video where he discovered that the new PS5 model has a reduced size heatsink and cooling apparatus. In this video, he made some pretty bold claims that I no longer agree with 100%, but generally speaking, in my opinion, it was a pretty solid video. The video was not bad. Now, where the controversy stems from is that Austin Evans says that the new PS5 is objectively worse than the original, based on the fact that it has a smaller cooler and also has hotter exhaust temperatures. And he obviously implied that the PS5 CPU must be running hotter because of it. Now, a lot of people did not agree with this, even going as far as doxing where he and his wife lives. Fucking internet, man. You'd think he shot someone's uncle for that to be warranted, but no, he just roasted someone's favorite piece of plastic. He obviously made a response video to all the negativity that I'll also link down below. And if you were one of the people leaving malicious comments toward him or literally putting his address on the internet, I'd highly recommend you give it a watch so he at least has a chance to defend why he's allowed to have an opinion. You could think it's a trash opinion, but he's still allowed to have it. And sheesh, even I could have bad opinions. As a lot of you guys have pointed out in my last video, the PS5's variable clock speeds don't actually shift directly based on temperature, meaning that the smaller cooler Austin discovered would never lead to any in-game performance loss, like ever. That will never happen. I rewatched Sony's GDC conference with Mark Cerny, and this is 100% correct. The smaller cooler will never mean you lose any performance in game under any circumstances, and I'm confirming that right now. See, at the time of making my last video, it had been a long time since I made my last console tech upload, so a lot of that stuff had just kind of left my mind, and I made some assumptions. I'm only human. And of course, saying I'm only human doesn't automatically absolve all the mistakes we make, so I sincerely apologize from the bottom of my heart and hope to clear up any misconceptions with this upload. So my biggest problem with the response to the last video wasn't actually people correcting my mistake on variable clock speeds. It was the amount of people who believed that higher temperatures did not matter at all when they most definitely do. In a very small chance worst case scenario that will never happen to the average person. Can't forget that asterisk for those who might choose to put my address on the internet. Like, the basic tone of a lot of angry commenters was essentially, the PS5's clocks don't shift based on temperature, so this cooling change will never come into play. And yes, while this is technically true from a gameplay perspective, even if the PS5 doesn't throttle on you when it's starting to get too hot, it'll still behave like a traditional console in that it will shut off once it exceeds a certain temperature. So saying that it doesn't throttle based on temperature doesn't solve all the problems that might arise in the future due to having a smaller cooler. Do you get what I'm trying to say? And it also means that Austin Evans' video is not completely irrelevant. But in either case, I am very sorry about that variable clock speed comment, and I hope I cleared up any confusion I might have caused. So let's continue with proving why Austin Evans' original video was actually correct, in that removing a sizable chunk of your heatsink is never good, and without a shadow of doubt will lead to hotter SoC temperatures. And disclaimer, Austin Evans is not always correct. Longtime subs will know that I've called him out on questionable behavior in the past, because he has shown some spouts of bias towards Microsoft and the Xbox Series X. But because someone was wrong yesterday, doesn't mean they can't be right today. Just keep that in the back of your head. So let's address the biggest misconception and one of the largest arguments I've seen at the bottom of my video, and as well as Austin's, that is simply untrue. The notion that hotter exhausts mean the new cooler is doing a better job of getting heat out of the console, implying that the new one might actually be running cooler than the original, and that there would be no way to verify that the new one is running hotter without proper testing. But I'm here to tell you right now, that is never the case, and the people who insinuated this and put that notion out there, I'm not here to name names or anything like that, but the ones who did it, it was very irresponsible for them to do so. And since I know some of you guys will ask, I did see Gamers Nexus response to this whole situation, where they criticized Austin's testing methods, stating that pointing a thermal camera at a heatsink is not a reliable way of measuring a processor's performance, but implied that his conclusion might still be correct. And I agree that pointing a thermal camera at a heatsink or exhaust is usually not a good indication of what temperature any given processor is operating at. I mean, it depends on the heatsink, depends on the processor, depends on the case, depends on a lot of things. You will never be able to tell what exact temperature any processor is running at just by using a thermal camera on its heatsink or exhaust. That much is 100% true. But in the case of comparing two identical systems where the only significant difference seems to be in the heatsink, measuring the exhaust temperatures is not a flawed method. Because in that particular case, you aren't looking for specific temperatures, but rather a temperature shift in relation to an already identical product. Like, if we can confirm that both these PS5s were built the exact same way and use the exact same SoC, use a near identical Wi-Fi chip, and the only major difference is that they reduce the heatsink, then and only then, measuring at the exhaust is a good method for comparing them to each other, but not comparing them to anything else or trying to figure out exactly what temperature they're running at. I hope that makes sense and that I don't get 90 comments of people saying, but did you see Gamers Nexus's video? Because I might lose my mind. But anyways, do hotter exhausts on a near identical console mean that the fan heatsink combo is doing a better job at exhausting heat, thereby keeping it cooler? Short answer, hell no. Long answer, hell no. But with steps. Now, I don't blame anyone for getting confused because thermodynamics is a very complicated subject, and this, ear-bleeding statement sounds intuitively true at first glance. But let's start to break down why it's not, and to do that we have to go over a couple basic principles. So heat. The most important thing you have to know is that heat is like air pressure, and it constantly wants to flow from a high concentration area to a low concentration area until it reaches equilibrium where all the heat is spread out evenly and no more quote-unquote flow occurs. This is based on entropy, which is a fundamental part of the second law of thermodynamics. And don't get afraid, the second law of thermodynamics basically dictates that entropy, or the disorder of the universe, always increases with time. And for the context of this video, that just means that heat can only flow from hot to cold and will never go the other way around. It also means that heat will dissipate or become less intense with time as well. Essentially, what that means is that you'll never have anything mystically heat up without an outside influence or heat generator. However, everything will naturally cool
middle and tend towards absolute zero or the lowest possible temperature. Pretty basic stuff. This means that the concept of cold, like a cold temperature, doesn't really exist, but it's actually just the absence of heat. So whenever you feel cold in your house, you're not quote unquote cold, but rather you just lack heat energy. So introducing the parts that you'll have to get familiar with. Here we have a processor, a fin stack, fan and heat pipe assembly, and an imaginary enclosing that we'll be putting all of our parts into with an intake vent and an outtake vent just like the PS5. So say we install the CPU into this imaginary case and start using the heatsink. The heatsink is operating properly and is aiding the cooling of the CPU by the means of both conduction and convection. I'm not going to take the time to explain how a heatsink works because it's decently complicated and not really that important to the argument at hand. I might consider making a video on it in the future though, so let me know if you guys want to see that. All you need to know for now is that cool air comes in and hot air goes out. Essentially, the CPU is literally giving its heat to the passing air with the help of the heatsink and fan. Every time the passing air gets hotter, the CPU gets a little cooler. And a big thing you need to know, and this is very important, it's that air in the case can and will be reused by the heatsink and fan to some degree, even if the intake and outtake fans were the most efficient in the world. Because trust me when I say, aerodynamics listens to nobody. You don't really need to know exactly why this is the case, but it has a lot to do with how light and unpredictable the flow of any one particular air molecule can be, and how by sheer probability some of it has to get reused. But now let me ask you guys a question. In this configuration, do you think the temperature of our exhaust air as it's being pulled from the CPU fan will be cooler or hotter than inside the case? Remember, the CPU fan is generating hot air in the case and it is getting pulled out by the exhaust. Think hard. The correct answer actually is, it depends where you measure. If you measure a couple inches away from the exhaust fan, your measurement will always be cooler. But as you approach the fan until you're basically touching the blades, you'll notice that the measurements will increase and increase until they match the temperature of the air in the case. You might be a bit confused, but it's actually pretty easy to explain. The second law of thermodynamics dictates this. The farther and farther you get from a heat source, in this case the exhaust fan, the more disorderly that kinetic energy distribution becomes and everything will tend towards a cooler temperature. So of course, the farther you measure from the exhaust fan, the cooler the reading you'll get, since the heat has escaped the case and has been allowed to disperse and disorder itself into the world, getting cooler. You know, you could stand pretty close to a fire and feel that heat without getting burned, but the closer and closer you move to it, the hotter it becomes until, well, ouch. I.e., the fire will never be hotter the farther you stand from it, if that makes sense. And what this means is that, according to the second law of thermodynamics, the exhaust temperature of any computer assembly can only be the same or cooler as the temperature of the air within the case. It can never be hotter. If you're exhausting hotter air than your heatsink is producing, not only would you have bigger problems to worry about since it's probably 200 degrees in your room, but you might be Doctor Strange. And this is a key concept to keep in mind when thinking why Austin Evans taking hotter exhaust temperatures as an indication of a hotter running CPU is 100% without a shadow of doubt accurate. So now that we know that a console's exhaust temperature can never be hotter than the temperature measured within the case, we can go over 3 scenarios of a CPU and its heatsink. So let's say this heatsink is attached to a working CPU, and this CPU is letting off a consistent and unchanging amount of heat energy. There are 3 scenarios that can be going on at any one instant. Scenario 1, the CPU is cooling down. Scenario 2, the CPU is at equilibrium. And scenario 3, the CPU is heating up. Let's take a look at scenario 1. If the CPU is cooling down and you were to think about it misconceptually, then the system would be exhausting a higher amount of heat than the CPU that was running warmer. But again, this isn't the case. If the CPU actually is cooling down, then that means our heatsink is able to bring in more cool air into the fin stack than the heat of the CPU is able to saturate, which means that less hot air will be exhausted into the case since most of it will be carried through to the exhaust. And with less competing hot air being reused, cool air from the intake fan has a fair chance of getting into the fin stack, cooling the CPU even further. And when this cycle continues for a while, the CPU begins cooling down. And if you didn't understand that or the diagram, it can be summarized into one slightly less confusing sentence. The speed of new cool air coming into the case far exceeds the CPU's ability to saturate it, so no hot air is allowed to fester or be reused and is immediately exhausted when generated, therefore keeping the internal temperature of the case relatively low. Again, this is for the sole reason that the CPU literally can't generate enough heat to quote-unquote keep up with the heatsink. And since the internal temperature is relatively low, fresh cool air dominates the case, which helps the heatsink operate more effectively, so the CPU continues cooling down, which means that less heat gets exhausted back into the case, meaning that the internal temperature gets even lower. So a near perpetual domino effect begins to happen as the CPU cools, because the fans are bringing in a surplus of cold air, allowing the heatsink to operate more effectively. Point being, when a heatsink is doing a good enough job that the SoC begins cooling, the overall temperature of the case actually goes down because of this loop. And if you measure at the exhaust, that little bit of heat the CPU was letting off as it began cooling down is what you'd first measure, but as you continue to measure with time, less heat is going to be exhausted. So the exhaust temperature of a cooling CPU also goes down. Because remember people, the second law of thermodynamics, the exhaust of a system can never be hotter than the internal temperature. And to oversimplify what I just said here, if you're still having trouble understanding, in layman's terms, if the CPU is cooling down, there will be less heat generated in the system and therefore less heat will be exhausted. And going back to our misconception, we have to ask ourselves, where is this excess heat coming from? If the quote-unquote better heatsink was actually performing better, the CPU would have less heat to go around in the case, leading to cooler internals. The CPU is the only source of heat, so if you're cooling that down and your exhaust air is still hot, there is a fundamental problem with the situation, or you might have accidentally left the heat gun attached to your PlayStation. And if you're still having a hard time believing this, let's go over scenario 2 and 3, which might do a better job at convincing you. Scenario 2, the CPU is at equilibrium. So if the CPU and heatsink are at equilibrium, this means the fans are pulling in just enough air into the case that the CPU is able to use most of it, but not oversaturate it. When this occurs, the temperature of the CPU does not change, and neither does the internal temperature of the case. Everything is steady. What's going on here is that the fans are bringing the CPU just enough air and the exhaust is getting that air out in a timely manner. But the fans aren't bringing any excess cool air, so the CPU can't cool down, but it's also not heating up. Pretty straightforward. In this situation, if you measured the exhaust temperature of the system, it would be unchanging with time and would directly correlate to the efficiency of the cooling apparatus under scrutiny. Why? Because once the CPU and heatsink reach equilibrium, the heatsink and fan system are essentially at capacity and can no longer cool the system any further. If it was any more efficient, the CPU would begin cooling down as in scenario 1, and if it was any less efficient, it would begin heating up. And remember, the internal temperature of the case will directly correlate to the temperature of the open air processor. And now let's look at scenario 3. The CPU is heating up. This scenario basically means that the fans and heatsink are not doing an acceptable job cooling the CPU, and it is able to completely saturate the air being brought to it with as much heat as possible. What this essentially leads to is another domino effect as described in scenario 1, only the opposite. As the CPU heats up, it will begin to give off more heat, meaning that the internal temperatures will get higher, so hot air will begin dominating the case, which decreases the heatsink's ability to properly cool the CPU, so the CPU continues to heat up. And this cycle will continue until an equilibrium state like in scenario 2 is reached, or your console shuts off. And if you were to measure the exhaust temperature of this heating up CPU once it reaches equilibrium, it will 1000% be hotter than any other heatsink that was doing a more efficient job, as described in scenario 1. A really good real world example I could give you would be, when was the last time you placed a laptop on your lap and its exhaust temperature getting scorching hot was an indicator that it was doing a better job at cooling your processor and that it might actually be running cooler than if your laptop wasn't running scorching hot? Do you kind of see what I'm trying to get at here? A better heatsink will do a better job at getting heat energy to disperse. If that heat energy is still coming out all clumped up and hot at the exhaust, your heatsink is not doing a good job. Overall point being, don't believe every little thing you read on the internet, especially when it has to do with physics.
Hey, so it's not every day I interrupt one of my animated videos to leave like a little footnote like this. And if you guys don't want to watch it, if you're not interested in what I'm about to say, there's gonna be like a little counter somewhere on your screen that you could just skip past that counter to continue with the rest of the animated video if you're not interested. But this is for people who are interested in this little video by another channel with around 3K subs that's going kind of semi-viral. I'm not gonna give you the name of the channel or like anything that they're associated with, because I don't think they're putting out credible information and I don't want this video to get any more viral than it is. But I did take some screenshots from it and we're going to evaluate what they said in this video. But basically they did some quote unquote testing that showed that the new PS5 is actually running cooler than the old one, which obviously by a physics standpoint doesn't make sense, which I will talk about in this video. So I just wanted to go into their video, dissect it a little bit, and just inform you guys as to why you should be a bit more skeptical paying attention to people on the internet. So I do have some screenshots. So if you look at this right here, these were some of their test results. Again, not going to tell you the name of the channel, but basically there's a couple things I want to point out. Number one, they said that the temperature of the old PS5 is 51 CPU. The old PS5 CPU is 51.1 C, and the CPU temperature of the new PS5 is 40.8 C, a difference of 11 degrees centigrade, which is absolutely ridiculous. And also these temperatures were measured after 30 minutes of playing Devil May Cry 2. Which is ridiculous, because I can tell you right now, as an owner of a literal $3,000 gaming PC with an all-in-one liquid cooler, my idle temperatures don't get as low as 40 degrees C. And you're telling me a console with the cooling mechanism as small as the PS5, right, can hit that low? I'm already skeptical about that. And then number two, literally the real-time measurements there, this is a screenshot so it's not fluctuating right now, but literally their real-time measurements as they were showing them in the video did not line up with what they were showing here. They didn't even look close to be averages. Like, look here. So the temperature of the new PS5 CPU as is being measured in real time in their video was 31.95, but here it's showing up as 40.8 C, another difference of around 9 degrees centigrade. Doesn't really make sense as to what's going on. And something else that I want to point out is that the exhaust of the new PS5 is 42 degrees centigrade, whereas the temperature of the CPU itself was 40 degrees, which also does not make sense, because I'm actually going to go on to explain in this video. By pure coincidence, it wasn't to like call a shot at these guys or anything like that, but by pure coincidence, I'm going to go on to explain why the temperature of your CPU or your internal temperature of your console can never be lower than your exhaust temperature. Your exhaust temperature can never be higher than the temperature that you're going to get in the case. So this already breaks the laws of physics, and you're going to see why in this video. And let's go on to the next picture so I could just show you something else real quick. So this was their testing methodology. Like, they just took a bunch of thermal sensors, which is these green things, and taped them to the back of the PlayStation, which, if that doesn't show you how legitimate this is, like this is the literal picture, the literal slide that they used to show what they were doing. They have thermal sensors just being slid into the PS5 and they taped them or whatever, and they did this or whatever. It just doesn't look very nice to the eye, in my opinion, and could have been done better. They even have a multimeter down here. You guys might not know what a multimeter is, but I use this a lot when I go to design silicon when I'm taking classes, because we have a lot of projects where we use these to like test parts that we make. And one thing that really triggered me is the fact that they busted out this huge multimeter that they most definitely did not need to test this PS5. They brought this out for show, and that just got me mad, because trust me, they did not need this. 100% did not need this at all. And the fact that he calls the last reading VA kind of implies to me that he doesn't really know what he's talking about, because nobody who owns one of these things will call the last unit VA. It's volt amps. He says he confidently lists off the top three in the way that they're supposed to be listed. He says volts, amps, power, stutters for a bit, VA, because he doesn't know what it means. So that's another thing. I don't know. So the entire video to me, and he did upload a second video where he uploaded more correct, closer to correct temperature measurements, because the first ones, like I said, just broke the laws of physics. And these also don't work out very well with the laws of physics and don't line up with previous tests done by Gamers Nexus and other people. They just don't line up. And a lot of people have been sending me this video thinking that, you know, oh my gosh, look, in a sense, what you said was wrong. Like, you know, this guy proved that the new console is cooler. And all I'm going to say about that is just hold your horses, right? And wait for Gamers Nexus to upload a video where he does the tests more concretely. So if you know who I'm talking about, great. Now you know that I didn't like this video. Oh, and the fact that he literally splattered all of his thermal measurements with like 40 pounds of electrical tape and like another pound of thermal paste on each of the connections, which putting that much on such a tiny sensor will actually inhibit its measuring performance, but we're not even gonna go there. But yeah, I don't like the video is what I should say. So I don't approve of it. If you want to believe it, that's fine. Everyone's entitled to their own opinions. I just personally don't, and I showed you my reasons for that. But again, if you want to, go ahead. And now back to the video.
So yeah, that's going to do it for this video. Not one I wanted to make per se, but was fun nonetheless. But don't worry, your regularly scheduled programming will resume whenever it gets finished. I'd be very surprised if once Gamers Nexus does their tests that the new model actually does run cooler or at the same temperature as the old one, because that pretty much defies all logic. But it would also indicate that there are some larger things at play, like potentially more part swaps that Austin Evans didn't notice in his original video. But as long as those things are identical, trust me, the newer one cannot and will not run cooler. Thinking about making a Call of Duty themed video next, or maybe I'll make that heatsink video, we'll see what happens. But for now, if you liked the video, leave a like. If you disliked the dislike, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss a future upload on the channel. Oh, and hit that bell notification button if you're so inclined. I've been Innocence, you've been the audience, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace out.